Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast we work to dissect, analyze, investigate, explore, and explain the amazing and epic power of storytelling. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
Kevin. It is currently June 2026, and we are in sunny Los Angeles, living together again. U.S., Canada, Mexico are hosting the World Cup, and this is a big deal for me too because I am, as I say to people, aggressively Canadian, and I'm living in America. So it's really exciting to see Canada rally behind the World Cup and America rally behind the World Cup. And I'm not a big sports guy, but I have gotten into sports in key moments when Canada gets behind sports teams. So on the screens right now, which you don't see, I have two pages open because tomorrow Canada is playing South Africa in the World Cup, and me and my friend are trying to get tickets for a reasonable price. So I have the last minute pages open. But it's this interesting thing about sports where whether it's because your parents were really into a team, or it's the city you were born or a city you call home, rallying behind it and feeling that connection to that story is really powerful. We also even saw it with the Knicks.
Yeah, and with the Knicks, it also turned into not just the New York or the tri-state area, but a nationwide support as they advanced to the finals. Because the last time they had won the NBA championship was 53 years ago. So it was a very long drought with a bunch of underdog players that naturally serves a very good story that really drive people to rally behind. But we could lose Gaurav any second here, folks. He has two other screens up and running, trying to get a ticket.
So we'll see. We'll update you if we get tickets. We might not.
This is Kevin reporting back in post-production. Gaurav did get the tickets to the game, and Canada beat South Africa 1-0. They scored a goal towards the end of the stoppage time and advanced to the final 16, made the nation's history in the World Cup. So congrats to Canada.
But it's funny because you were mentioning how so many people are rallying behind the Knicks because of the drought. It was funny how many Americans rallied around the Blue Jays this year because Blue Jays were the underdogs and Americans were kind of sick of the Dodgers winning, right? So it was funny about, like, it's not only your city, but also the storyline you can latch onto. Like, you get excited when an underdog makes it to the finals, when they defeat the odds. So many people said to me, it's amazing that America's team this year is Canadian, with the Dodgers versus the Blue Jays.
Well, Gaurav, as we wait for the pages to refresh and see if we can finally make it into this World Cup game of Canada in LA, what can we say about our expert storyteller this week, Alex Mayyasi?
I love that this is the recording because, like, I think it adds to the story that I keep looking down. Today's guest is a really, really exciting one because I have been a fan of the podcast Planet Money for many moons. It takes these really important and complex economic terms and it teaches you them in, like, real ways, or it takes these big stories and breaks them down. Like, how does book publishing work? There was one I really loved as a comic book fan. It was about the comic book industry, where they went out, they found a character in the public domain, they made a comic book about it, they sold the comic book, they distributed the comic book, and they even made a Broadway show. And along the way, they taught us about those businesses, all the functions, how they work. So Alex, he was a longtime contributor with the podcast, and he was tasked with, okay, if we were to make a book, how would we make this book? And we got to dive in with Alex about how do you turn a podcast, a successful, well-known historic podcast, into a book? How do you distill that storytelling style?
And besides Planet Money, we also talked to Alex about the upcoming exciting work. Alex is hosting a new podcast himself called Gastronomics, and it talks about the business in the food industry. For example, the waiting page of Domino Pizza and how that has influenced software design in so many different fields, as well as on a more personal note, how has the journalistic roots of Alex influenced how he approaches podcasts. So without further ado, let's get into our conversation with Alex.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. Cause life can be dry, better dress for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gaurav and Kevin.
Alex, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Yeah, my name's Alex Mayyasi. I'm a journalist. Most recently came out with the book Planet Money, which is based on the NPR podcast of the same name, where I've also been a contributor over the years and have been a contributing reporter and guest co-host going back to, I want to say 2017. I've been both a business and economics reporter, and then I was actually also a food editor at Atlas Obscura for 4 or 5 years in New York City. So those are my kind of twin professional passions.
I love when we have journalists on the show, because we were talking a bit earlier. We are very clear that we are not journalists. It's just such a unique version of storytelling where the bar is so high. And we live in this world where journalism is incredibly important for education and information and truth inherently in our society. So I want to ask you first about how has your background in international relations gave you this kind of different journalistic lens on economics?
Yeah, I mean, when I graduated college, I was an international relations major, like you said. I was studying Arabic, had spent time in the Middle East, and I moved to Cairo, Egypt. It was 2011. It was the Arab Spring. And so an exciting time to be there. And I was very inspired by what was going on there. Part of going there was to kick the tires on whether I wanted to be a diplomat or an expat in the Middle East for my career. And it was a very formative time, and I'm glad I went and very appreciative that I was able to go. But my answer after about a year there or 9 months there was like, I don't think that's what I want. And then I moved back to the US, to San Francisco, and kind of stumbled into journalism. I haven't focused, it's not like I became an international correspondent. I didn't focus on international affairs. Like we just mentioned, did a lot of like business and economics reporting, which is how I ended up linking up with Planet Money, as well as food journalism, because that's something I really love too. But I do think having spent a significant amount of time abroad, both in parts of the Middle East, as well as like studying abroad in France, which was very nice and bougie experience to get to have as an undergrad, and taking a lot of history classes, international politics classes. I think that's just been like a nice additional add to my perspective. And certainly that's a benefit when you do get to work on larger teams as a journalist, because, maybe at Planet Money, there's a lot of interest, of course, in like business and economics, right? But then people also bring their own different experiences, backgrounds, sub-interests that can often kind of like enrich the types of stories that people pitch and propose. Certainly for me, I think I have, say, like awareness of like countries where the military is running huge businesses in places like Egypt that maybe isn't like on your radar if you didn't have that experience.
As you kind of look at your career and work on these different topics, from business economics with Planet Money, from food with your new podcast and your past work, to writing this book, to international relationship journalism, when you look at like those different degrees of journalism, how do you apply storytelling? How important is storytelling to your work?
In hindsight, it seems silly that it never occurred to me that journalism might be something I should be curious about and look into when I was an undergrad. Like I even worked on a college magazine, and still the thought never occurred to me, even though as someone who liked learning about new things, it was very curious. And so one of the things that really pushed me in this direction was when I was in Cairo, Egypt. I was there to take Arabic classes, volunteer at a nonprofit that was doing election monitoring, and just kind of find my way, maybe find a job. And one of my professors introduced me to a very prominent Egyptian democracy activist who wanted help writing a book. And the first time I talked with him or interviewed him, was recording the conversation so we could write about it later, or I could write about it later. There was this moment where he's talking about his father, who was a politician who would always run for office, but he was a liberal reformer, so he was never actually allowed. There would always be fraud. He would never actually win the election. And there's this moment he's talking about the end of his father's life, and I stop the activist Ahmed for a second as he's talking. I'm like, wait, are you saying that the last conversation you had with your father before he died was him telling you, don't waste your life in politics like I did? he said, well, we managed to have a small conversation or two after that. But yeah, that really was. And like, that was, I mean, that's like a cinematic moment. If you put that in a screenplay, that then this guy goes on to become a, very brave and prominent democracy activist in the 10 years leading up to the Egyptian Revolution, that would almost feel like too on the nose, for a screenplay. Like maybe you have to make it more subtle or something. And that was, I mean, both a little tragic, but also beautiful. And I think that was just that one of those moments where I just kind of got excited because I was like, he just has an amazing story. The entire world's eyes were on Cairo and Egypt, but like he could talk about the 10 years of activism that led up to that moment. And as well, right? Like he had this incredible personal story. And so I think those are moments that have continued both to excite me, when you get those cinematic moments or just like emotional moments in a story, be able to like relate this to people in a really interesting way. And I think it ultimately ended up being particularly helpful for reporting on business and economics, especially in the style of Planet Money, because Planet Money is especially focused on storytelling, also often finding, okay, we want to talk about inflation. We want to talk about X, Y, or Z kind of big economic force. Can we find someone who's experiencing that and grappling with it firsthand, or who are kind of the main characters of this story? And so I always get excited when there's that kind of moment when you realize there's this like spark of emotion at the center of something, or those moments are kind of there to explore and share with readers or listeners.
Yeah, that's great. And we have talked to many folks on the show about what their past experiences and careers have inspired them, or, things that might not even be directly related to what they do now that they can apply into their day-to-day work in the moment. And obviously, in your case, there is a lot that can be directly translated from your past to your current experience. But what about podcasting specifically? When you first got into doing podcasts, are there anything about this kind of recording format that you had to adjust to that you didn't realize?
100%. Yeah. Because I definitely got started in print journalism, or I mean, really digital journalism, but like writing articles. You have a lot of ability, right? When you're writing an article, yeah, you're calling people up, you're going to meet people and interviewing them, and you're going to quote them. But you have so much ability to kind of write around things. So I think, one big lesson of starting to work in audio with Planet Money and otherwise, not that I wasn't like planning before my interviews before, but I think just how much planning you really need to do, because you need to know exactly what you need to get, because you might not be able to go back to it, right? Like if you didn't get that piece of tape, or, the person you're interviewing expressing this idea or sharing this or that, like you might be able to go back to them, but in a lot of cases, like you just can't, like you just won't have that. Writing an article, I might often think about like, what are the things I need to learn? What do I need to understand to like explain inflation well, or whatever it is? I think with Planet Money in particular, people at Planet Money might often spend quite a bit of time before an interview thinking about like, how might we first introduce this person in the podcast episode? We often refer to it as like their walk-on tape. Maybe they appear in the introduction, maybe they appear kind of like in minute 4 or 5 or whatever after we've done the introduction. You can always do, hi, can you introduce yourself? But like, could we ask this question to kind of produce a funny moment or an interesting reaction? The kind of cliche one at this point is if you interview someone who's won the Nobel Prize, it's like, can you introduce yourself? And they say something, and they're all like nice, humble people. And you're like, and you won a Nobel Prize, right? Or like, or where were you when you like learned you won the Nobel Prize? But there are a million different ways clever ways you could think about to introduce someone. And I think also just thinking about how you can kind of set up things that will be like moments. Like, what's an answer that you think, oh, that's so surprising, we want to make sure we like get that surprise. Maybe sometimes you might be interviewing someone who's a little bit more like soberly and scholarly. You want to be ready to be like, okay, we'll ask them this question. If they give a kind of like standard answer, you want to be ready to be like, wait, no, that's not how it's supposed to work, right? Or like whatever it is, kind of being ready to like make a moment out of something. And just to push for emotion, I think, is also something that I learned working with Planet Money that I wasn't thinking about as much. I think especially business and economics, you might often talk to people and they're kind of giving you their analysis. It's kind of remarkable how often we're asking different versions of like, how did that make you feel? Because there'll be those moments where you're talking to someone about collecting GDP data or whatnot. I'm casting around for a real example right now, but like, they'll just like say something extremely personable or like connect it to we care about these metrics and data and economic ideas because of how they impact our lives. And suddenly they'll make that connection in a way that's very personal for them or whatever it is. So those were some of the things that were adjustments. And then I'm still learning to not say 50 million times when I'm recording podcasts, and try to be a little bit more kind of, put together interviewer, like someone like Oprah on TV who's very poised, whereas I tend to have a tendency, I'm excited, I'm talking about ideas, I do a kind of false start, I go here, I go there. So, some of that is certainly okay. I don't think people expect or maybe even want everything to be perfectly polished. But yeah, especially now as I'm hosting a new podcast that's much more like interview format, that is something that I think will make it a lot better if and when I keep getting better at being a little bit more like polished and not doing false starts and saying all the time.
Now, that's an interesting idea, I think, for you to try to almost remove some of your personal styles as you do these interviews in your role.
I wouldn't say it's like remove personal style. Because I think if you look at some really great interviewers, I mean, Oprah, Ezra Klein, like whoever it is, Terry Gross, they're quite polished, but they still have a lot of personality. Like no one's like, oh, Oprah, you could just swap her in for anyone else. That machine, it's like no personality there. So I think it's just a little bit more, that level of like speaking quite clearly. But I don't think at all that means getting rid of your voice. I mean, I also think working in audio taught me much, you on tape will be part of what you might present to people in a way that's not true when you're writing articles, when you're doing print. So I think sometimes like the great tape people are always talking about in audio, like sometimes that's not some sort of like, it sounds like you're ready to moderate a presidential debate. Sometimes the amazing tape is just being like, you're taking a tour of something and you get to the top floor and you're like, oh my God, it's so, it's just like, it's a very genuine moment. It's not that it's all like super polished or it doesn't contain your voice.
It's funny because I was actually going to ask the opposite question. Because Kevin asked about like kind of bring down your character and how do you like cut yourself out to focus on the guest. I was actually going to ask the opposite because I think when you play around with journalism, you can read personalities in different journalists, but for the most part, it's about the story, right? You're reading what the person wrote. It's about the guest for the most part. But when you're listening to like Guy Raz or Kara Swisher or some of these great journalistic interviewers, you see their personality, right? One of the things about our show, we talk about this a lot, is like we have to become characters in ourselves because they come for the guests, stay for us, right? That model is how a lot of these podcasts build. Was that a hard transition for you to understand that now you're a character in this podcast? And how did you go about kind of developing that character to a point where you are now going on to host your own?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting mix, right? Because I think you are, in some sense, you can become a character, but also certainly like, especially when you're interviewing someone about something that's quite hard, it's like, oh, you and your family were moving and trying to, survive and keep your heads above water. I'm not going to suddenly make this all about me. But absolutely, I think a lot of cases, if the interviewer just kind of like disappears into the woodwork, it's like, what's the point? What are we here for? Especially sometimes when someone has a new book out and it's on the bestseller list and that person might be doing like, kind of going on like 30 different places. It's like, if the interviewer is just kind of setting them up to go on their standard spiel, it's like, what value are you providing? They could just go listen to them anywhere. It's an interesting balance. I think part of it is just practice. Feeling confident enough in your prep and having enough at bats that then you are kind of able to like relax a little bit more and be able to engage genuinely because you're not like so concerned about, I need to get this, this, and this. And I'm like absolutely describing myself. I'm not so, I've only like semi-recently transitioned to audio. So this is absolutely things I'm working on. It's absolutely the case that like, it's not very long ago, right? That, I would listen back to the recording and be like, oh, there's not a lot of me engaging in this nice back and forth or having reactions because I know I was looking at our question list and trying to be like, oh, what do we still need to get? We got 20 minutes left. What do we still need to get? So I do think some of it is just like, it's just at bats, it's just practice. And then as you're more comfortable, you're confident that you're going to get what you need to get. You're able to settle in probably more, or at least this has been my experience, that then you're able to settle in more and more paying attention to the person you're talking to, more engaging and having that back and forth because you kind of have that confidence that you've got this second awareness of like what you need to do. Or, you know, if you're lucky enough, you've got a great producer who's like there to kind of like, I mean, that's also a way that it can be done, that, you know, the host can be, or interviewer can be very focused on like having this engaging conversation, and a producer can be keeping an eye on the time, keeping an eye on the question list, and being able to kind of like pop in and be like, hey folks, we have 10 minutes left. I think there are this and this question we should really make sure to get to. I mean, not something I have right now, like my new podcast, Gastronomics. I'm kind of a one-man band, but that's certainly can be nice if you have that, a team where a producer, or if you're two hosts, one host can kind of be focused on being super present while the other does a little bit more of the like logistics, keeping an eye on the time and making sure you hit all the most important questions. That can be a really nice way to do it.
That's kind of how we work when we host, because we're kind of a two-man show. I am not.
I'm sorry to mansplain your own approach to you.
It's good live and I.
No, it's good because like it's kind of similar where like I am very free flowing and moving, and usually we have two mics, and like I'm just kind of on the mic talking and seeing what happens. And Kevin's like, okay, time. Do we have a question here? Are we all set up? Checking levels. And because he goes through the editing process, right? And because Kevin sees the editing side, he can kind of see that level. I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, though, I feel like it also comes back to get me a little bit when I'm actually in the conversation. Because sometimes I think too much about, okay, how is that part going to come out in post? If I say something like this, what does it mean for me in editing? You know, so I'm constantly like going through the editing lens, but sometimes that can distract me a little bit from the actual conversation.
For sure. I've had this experience where like, yeah, I'm now, you know, I am the editor and the like host interviewer. And there are times where I'm like, we're kind of going off down a sidebar and like some part of me just wants to like let it go. We might end up somewhere really cool. And another part of me now that like I'm a one-man band doing all the editing and production is like, it might be nice to just kind of like take control of the conversation and ask a question that's exactly the next setup to avoid those needs to like do more cuts. I think there is a bit of a level of like what type of show you are, what resources you are. Because certainly at Planet Money, one privilege of working there is like it's a big team, amazing producers, engineers, and reporters, very high production values, right? Like a lot of time spent on each episode with a full team. And so you can kind of, as long as you have enough time with the guest, go off on tangents, see if it leads you somewhere really interesting, you know, take time to kind of have these interesting back and forths, take some risks. Because you know you are going to be going into the studio and recording your kind of lines that like set things up, that set up the next part of the interview, just like little bits of the interview. Whereas, yeah, if you're maybe doing a more like straight interview show, you're like me, it's pretty much just all one person, or even just it's just a small team that's trying to do a pretty good amount of like quantity, you know, show a week or 2 shows per week. Then sometimes there's maybe not as much. It might be smarter to kind of keep like a little bit tighter reins on the conversation, because you know that will like work for your interview format and won't require as much editing and reworking.
Yeah, I've been a Planet Money listener for many years. It was one of my like original core shows, and I love the show. And I think it's so interesting. I studied economics in college, so listening to Planet Money, seeing that intersection between storytelling and economics has always been so fascinating because I always walk away learning something. Taking a step back, how would you describe Planet Money? And when you walk into the booth, do you kind of like lock into the Planet Money version of you, or do you kind of just record and then let them edit it into a Planet Money episode?
Yeah. I mean, I think for the first part, like how I describe Planet Money and how Planet Money folks describe the show, it got its start, as you may very well know, in 2008 during the Great Recession, where there was this real hunger, like suddenly you needed to know what a collateralized debt obligation was to like understand what was going on in the world. And so the goal of Planet Money was really to explain the economy and what was going on with the economy, and do it, you know, in a way that wasn't intimidating. You know, we'd often talk about kind of like if a smart friend was explaining what was going on in the economy to you in a bar. And so, of course, we've talked about that's often meant looking for opportunities where there is kind of a quote unquote character who you can talk to or follow to see as they are kind of at the center of something interesting going on in the economy or important going on or grappling with these big economic forces, and then being able to learn through the format of the story and someone with real emotions, a real person, make something that's often quite abstract, less abstract. I will say as maybe a kind of insight I can offer there too is that like it's not like no one else has ever thought about using storytelling when it comes to business and economics.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I think the Planet Money team has really like over years like developed a particularly good approach to it. It has been striking to me how often working on Planet Money episodes and then on chapters of the Planet Money book that you actually did not need to spend that many like minutes of the episode or words or paragraphs of the chapter describing personal details or like the plot of that person's story. And I don't think that's because like it's unimportant. Like they might be the total core, but I think in a Planet Money episode, you really need to have such like economy of words and focus because you kind of can't go off on too many tangents, right? Like you'll lose people. It's very easy to balloon to like 45 minutes, which you never want, right? Like, so you're always cutting. And I think that was something that really struck me was realizing how much you really could capture the core of the narrative of someone's story very economically, like without needing to spend a lot of time. It was kind of surprising me how there was almost like more you could cut. And you're like, actually, I don't think I've given short thrift to them at all. Like I've really just, you've cut the fat and still covered the essential there. So I do think that's something that has been quite interesting for me to realize through my time working with Planet Money, which was a pretty formative experience for myself as a journalist.
I mean, selfishly, I'm going to ask you for advice there because I think when we've interviewed such a wide breadth of people, we pride ourselves, and this show is about interviewing different people from like crazy backgrounds. We've had wine experts, we've had PhDs, we've had CEOs. When you interview like a professor or a PhD for a non-technical audience, how do you go about making them more accessible? Like, is it choosing the right professor, or is it like, I'm going to prod you a little bit more to explain that more clearly?
Yeah. I mean, I do think what's good is that a huge luxury of, the time I've spent working with NPR is just like the NPR name. So many people are, to their huge credit, willing to be generous with their time and talk to you. And I do think often, like, I'm asking some very basic housing questions of like one of the world's foremost experts. It's like, I probably could have gotten this from like someone getting their PhD. But also I think people often who are like at the real top of their field are often just like very good at explaining, even the basics, right? Like they just understand it so well. They are able to explain things extremely well. And doing a longer interview where you're asking about a lot more of the kind of like fundamentals gives them a chance to, talk basics, talk about the fundamentals. I think it's kind of a running joke how often people for these longer interviews will be like, oh, this felt like therapy. It was so nice to like explain what I do and get to talk about like what's interesting, what's challenging, right? So I think that's also just a way for people having that time and space. They get to relax. You get to build trust. They're going to share things, which is always nice, right? Like it's a kind of crazy thing to trust a journalist or any podcaster, writer to like represent you well. And so I'm very grateful that people trust me and, colleagues of mine, past and present, to do so. And certainly I think having, spending a good amount of time, if you have it, asking them thoughtful questions to show that you're genuinely curious, have done the work, and are really invested in getting things right, that can go a long way for sure as well.
Yeah. And now, something I really like about the type of podcast that you have been doing is that it is in this style that interweaves between the actual live interview conversation with your experts, but also more importantly, the amount of narration that the host is doing themselves, and that narration oftentimes really string together the narrative of that entire episode. And something I'm curious about there is which comes first, basically, the chicken and egg problem. Are you setting out to do like the structure, the story of your episode first, and then try to fit your actual conversation into that? Or are you starting with a more organic conversation and then draw from there, okay, what kind of a story can I derive from the material I have? How often does that happen?
Yeah. I mean, with, say, a Planet Money episode, that's almost more like pitching a big magazine article, right? Because you're going to have multiple people spend a lot of time on it. So I think you're kind of raising the bar in terms of the pitching process, right? Before you go for it, you're really going to make sure, like, things could change, but like we kind of imagine this is probably what the top of the episode, the introduction, will be like act 1, act 2, act 3. And so of course things may change, but I think you do have a very good idea generally going in of what the episode will sound like, how it will be structured, and then go find tape. Therefore, knowing like what answers, information, responses you need to get from people you're interviewing. And then after that, listening to your interviews, highlighting all the stuff that really stood out as either really important or there was some fun emotion there or was super engaging or it was heartrending, but that was an important moment. And then kind of building your episode that way around the parts of the interviews that were really compelling and important and that what you want to include.
And at what point do you start feeling like, oh, there can be a book out of this, that there can be stuff that can be delivered in this different format?
Yeah. So I have over the years been like a contributor to Planet Money as a freelancer or what have you. The genesis from my side is that when I was working at Atlas Obscura, which for those who don't know it is very similar to National Geographic, although much, much newer than National Geographic. And I was a food editor there, publishing articles on the food section of the website called Gastro Obscura. But then we were also making sure that a lot of the articles and content we published could create a Gastro Obscura book. Mm-hmm. And so in 2021, I believe, is when we published the Gastro Obscura book. It was going to be 2020, and we were doing like final reviews of the book on the first day of lockdown. And we're like all in New York City in our separate apartments being like, actually, this might be the worst time in history to publish a book about food. So we ended up delaying a year, and I believe it was 2021 that we published the book. But, I think going through that experience and having collaborated with Planet Money over the years, it was just in my mind. I was just like, I think there should be a Planet Money book. I think it would be great. And I would love to write it. And I took that pitch to Planet Money. The idea had occurred to them over the years, like, oh, there could be a Planet Money book. Just no one had ever really, I think, gone much further than that is my understanding. But I also think part of it is that Planet Money has been around since 2008. They've published so many episodes, like you can't even find them all on a podcast player because there's a maximum number of podcasts that Spotify and other podcast players will let you put up there. Right. And so there's just so much information. It's like there was kind of a guide to the economy in Planet Money podcasts, but it was very scattered. So I think there's like a lot of value in being able to produce one book that you could hold in your hands, that you could read in one or several sittings, and not like it would be so comprehensive that like, that's it, you're done. But having this kind of like satisfying experience of being able to address like the biggest economic forces in one book. That felt really exciting and satisfying and something that would be quite valuable to a lot of people.
Yeah, and in the very Planet Money fashion, I know I really fall heavily in the making of a comic book when Planet Money made a comic book as a comic book fan myself. But in the very Planet Money fashion, not only did you make this book, but you guys made a podcast about making the book where you understood and delved deep into the publishing industry, into the bidding process, into this hidden side of the publishing industry. Did that change your writing process at all? What was it like to document your writing process as you went about it?
I mean, there were some moments where we were like getting on a call to decide which publisher to go with, like to choose to write the book. And, we're like, should we record this? But one of the Planet Money hosts, Alexei Horowitz-Ghazi, he made that series of podcast episodes for Planet Money about the making of the Planet Money book. So like it wasn't my responsibility to kind of be like preparing. And I think Alexei, he definitely like captured some different key moments on tape. There's this pretty long period when like the book is literally off to the presses and you just kind of like sit on your hands. And so it was mostly around then where Alexei was really in earnest making those episodes. So it was, if anything, just kind of a fun, different experience to be on the other side as like the journalist reporter is asking me questions.
We have been also dying to get into gastronomics, which by the time our episode here comes out, it will have launched in June 2026. We have been lucky enough to hear some of the earliest content of that show, and it's a great podcast with an interesting lens there. But
based on this endorsement, you must have gotten the version where I edited out a lot of odd breathing sounds, and not the earlier version that some of my early listeners got with like weird squeaks and like me breathing.
Honestly,
into the mic, so
I didn't hear a ton of that stuff, but Kevin knows we're used to hearing that from rough edits. Kevin knows I'm a big fidgeter, if anyone
Yeah.
can tell here. And it's weird because we're filming in the same room, so he can't cut away from me, so I keep noticing it. But like it's you hear weird sounds all the time from my mic because I'll hit something, I'll move something, I'll shake something. It's the bane of Kevin's existence. So I get that to my core.
Yeah, so it's honestly nice sometimes when I hear these things from other shows and be like, oh, people.
Oh my God. Yeah. I was listening to Derek Thompson's podcast the other day and I heard like, hopefully he's not mad I say this or something, but like, I feel like I heard the guest like hit the table or something like that. And I'm like, okay, like other people have flaws too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not Guy Raz. Guy Raz is perfect, but everyone else.
All right. Yeah.
But yeah, tell us a little bit about Gastronomics. If you were to describe the overarching story and mission of this show, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I have 2 taglines for the show. I don't know if that's allowed. Maybe if I, maybe if I had some stern showrunner, they'd tell me like, no, you have to pick. But I don't, so I get to say it's about the business of food and how economics shapes the modern menu. Right, I've been a business and economics reporter and I've been a food editor, so I am combining my 2 obsessions into one show. The show Gastronomics, that's about food and economics. I've just always found, I mean, actually with the Planet Money book, there are 5 sections of the book that are kind of like different parts of your life. And the first one has 2 chapters that are food related. And that's actually kind of a surviving fossil of how originally I wanted to make the entire first section of the Planet Money book food and drink. I love stories that are about food, but then are about, they're a business story or they're an economic story because just this like super fun, approachable way into these ideas. And so, it's just been really fun that now for my next big project, I get to like throw myself into this Venn diagram of my 2 interests. I think you listened to my episode about the secret life of the Domino's pizza tracker, that it's been this hugely influential feature and across all sorts of like product design, like people designing websites and apps of all kinds have been inspired by the Domino's pizza tracker. I'm just someone who like, there are a number of things that I'll learn and I'll just like want to tell people about it. That's why I think I found a pretty happy home in journalism. But in particular, I think there are times where I wrote this article about pad thai and then like wouldn't shut up about it for like 3 years, because it's just like so fun and interesting and crazy. And so I'm absolutely like losing my mind in some ways over some of the anxiety and stress that comes with launching a new project and the nervousness around it. But also it seems insane to me that like I might just be in a position where I get to learn about things at the intersection of food and economics, food and business, and share them with people. And that's what I do for a living. And that's what I do with a good chunk majority of my time.
And why is this show a video podcast? Like, how do the video part and the podcast part interact with each other? What does video add to it, and how do you keep it a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think the boring answer is just because it has now become conventional wisdom that if you start a new podcast, it has to be a video podcast. And I don't think that's 100% true. It is the case that discovery with audio podcasts is quite hard. You rely a lot on word of mouth. Whereas like on YouTube, there's so much more of like an all powerful algorithm potentially showing millions of people, if not your entire episode, a clip from your episode, right? There's just a lot more discovery possibilities with video podcasts because YouTube has really seen so much growth in podcasting. And a lot of it is because it's so much easier to discover podcasts because people will be like going to watch like an SNL clip they want to watch, but then they might be recommended, your podcast or whatever it is. So I think just if you're a new podcast and you're not someone with kind of like a huge built-in audience, there's a tons of potential. I think there are other reasons too. I do think I'm someone that like, I'm a little bit grudging about this and curmudgeonly where I'm just like, there are definitely some sacrifices to the audio side you make in order to do video. But like actually most people who like watch my podcast, which like I hope happens and I will be so grateful for anyone who does that. But at the same time, like they're probably going to like wander off and do dishes in the other room while it's still playing on the TV and just kind of like be hearing it. I'm kind of like, what are we doing here? So I do think what I would love to do over time is to be able to actually use the capabilities of video more. Food is something where I think being able to show things would be fantastic. I definitely don't have the resources to do that right now. But there's an episode I want to do about basically why like so few of us have ever actually tasted real wasabi. most sushi places, right? It's like horseradish with green food coloring. And there are interesting economic reasons for that, right? I could do a podcast about that where it's me interviewing someone and we're talking, but like, how cool would it be if I could go show like wasabi farms in Japan look super cool. I've never been to one. If I could be going around there with a camera and actually showing some of this, I would be thrilled, but that is all very hypothetical at this point. The short version is that video podcasts are like borderline required in the year of our Lord 2026 if you're starting a new show. I'm also like 100% open to the idea that like 5 years from now we'll be making jokes about like, remember when we all thought podcasts should be video podcasts? Like, what does that even mean? So I'm also like along for the ride and trying to figure it out.
Well, so the podcast industry is so interesting because people keep calling time of death on it consistently. It's kind of like how people keep calling time of death on the book industry. And these two industries constantly reinvent the format and the distribution, but the core of it's the storytelling. The core of it is I am in your ears talking about a very unique niche topic that might not apply to everyone, but it can find its audience. And with our show, we are saying storytelling behind everything, whether it's the episode we did with the wine expert about storytelling behind wine, or when we talk to psychologists about the stories we tell ourselves, we see this narrative thread, and it makes us like sometimes we're walking down the street and we're like, oh, what story is that billboard telling us consciously or unconsciously? Now that you've been doing this for a while and you've done Planet Money episodes and you've dove into the whole arc with the book, which we loved, and now you're doing like the economics behind food, do you see the world differently? Like when you're walking around, are you saying, oh, I wonder how this got to my plate, or I wonder what the economics behind that door is? Do you walk around and see economic storytelling everywhere, and how does that affect you?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a few things. I think one is just like having your radar up more is something certainly that I and other reporters, et cetera, have. And so you just like read one sentence in a book and you're like, that, like, this is actually like the origin story of my first Planet Money episode or it wasn't a book, but I read like one kind of throwaway line in an article. It was like, nowhere in the US does the government make it easy for you to pay your taxes, except this one program in California that only exists because this guy hired a lobbyist personally to lobby to make this program a reality. And you're like, wait, what? And like that became my first episode of Planet Money, right? So it's oftentimes, or just like, I can remember one of the most popular things I've ever written. A friend just kind of like mentioned it offhand. I was like, there was a famous marketing campaign that Subaru did targeted at lesbian women like back in the day. And that's why people all make jokes about like lesbians all driving Subarus, excuse me. And, like that was an amazing thing to learn about and kind of like this beautiful story. Where like it was a marketing campaign, but it was a huge deal for like the recognition of gay people in the US and better treatment in workplaces of like recognizing same-sex partners and offering benefits. But then I think the other is just taking action on it, right? I think plenty of people who are not in journalism or a kind of related field will have those observations, but it's just making sure that you're always tracking them down. You always email them to yourself or whatever your silly little system is in my case, to keep track of them and then follow up on it and do the work. Like ideas are cheap, execution is what matters, right? Absolutely matters for those observations. I'm sure I'm not alone among journalists who've just like read a long magazine article or listened to a great podcast episode and be like, oh, crap, I had that idea 3 years ago. Or I was basically onto that 3 years ago, but I didn't investigate it. I didn't go figure it out. And, I totally would have been great. And then I think maybe the other thing I could mention, we talked a lot about storytelling. I think something else that I've noticed for me, and I don't think I'm alone among journalists, is in addition to storytelling, I think my mind increasingly thinks in terms of metaphor, which I think that's not like a required skill. It's not like every journalist has kind of developed in that way, but I think particularly for what I do, which is often not like news reporting, but is often more like magazine style. I remember one episode of Gastronomics that will come out, I interview a trend forecaster. Right. So someone who has access to data from like 30,000 menus across the country, and they help chains and big food brands like Applebee's or Pacific Foods or Cheesecake Factory decide like what new menu items to add and kind of time things right. And so I had this moment where I asked her about like, like if I'm a weather forecaster, I've got like temperature data and like radar data. I see the clouds moving in. What are your tools to like forecast food trends? And, She tells me about like the menu data and social media data that they gather, and also doing like focus groups with consumers. And then also like often putting that a lot of times into like an algorithm or like an AI algorithm, or basically a model similar to like what a weather forecaster would use. I was like, oh, okay, it sounds like you're kind of like the same way that someone on Wall Street, someone in finance might gather a lot of like historical stock data, some like other alternative data that's relevant, and then like plug it into the AI algorithm to try and predict whether the stock will go up or whether interest rates will do X or Y. You are doing that, but to like predict whether ube lattes will be across the entire United States by 2027. And she's like, oh yeah, that's like a good way to think about it. You know, like sometimes thinking in metaphor, I think can be quite powerful. Just like having very good comparisons, examples to maybe, like make interesting connections, or at other times to just like bring out something else novel or make something unfamiliar, put it in terms that are familiar to a lot of your audience, readers, listeners. That can be quite helpful and powerful, I think.
Do you have any overarching advice for someone, say someone doesn't have time to, someone can't dedicate their life to journalism or to writing stories or doing podcasting? How do you become a better storyteller?
I mean, I think the age-old advice that I agree with as well is like reading and or listening to like really great stuff. When I was stumbling into journalism, I was just reading great magazine articles, great pieces of journalism all the time. It helps you develop. You learn to kind of do pattern matching. I think that was my training data, I guess, right? That like now I have this like pattern matching that helps me, you know, figure out how to like structure things and how to be a good editor or a good writer as the situation calls for it. So I think that's a lot of it. I could think very specifically, like when I was an editor and I would often have like younger writers who are newer, who I was kind of mentoring as part of being their boss. There were a few different like books and resources I would recommend. And one that seems helpful to mention here is a book by Stephen King called On Writing. Many people have recommended this book. Like it has so many helpful ideas for novelists, but I think also for journalists. But it's also a memoir. And like Stephen King is a really interesting person with a compelling personal story. There are all kinds of books you could read to get better at one kind of storytelling or another. But I am far from the only journalist who's noted that like this is incredibly helpful. So that's one I could point to very specifically.
To output, you must know to input. I love that. Great advice. And Alex, we have learned so much from you and about you. It's been amazing. And to wrap up our episode, we have this closing segment called Suspenders. This is where we ask you a fun, random questions unrelated to anything, and you can give us any answer you feel like. Question of the day is, what is one meal that unexpectedly changed you?
Oh, I like this. I'm trying to think if there's like one specific meal, because I am someone who like grew up in Massachusetts and I had never eaten a spicy thing in my life. I didn't know what basil was. I once like came back once I was like a college student in California with like a bag full of basil I'd gotten. I like heard there were these like basil bushes unattended all summer you could just go pick from, and I was like, is this the right thing? My roommate was like, so I mean, I think there's a way that just like going to college in California, I think was just like very formative. But it's not like there's no good food in Massachusetts or something like this, but I think it was also just like being in a culture of people who were really excited about food was not something I'd really been around, and just like opened a lot of things up of just like excitement and realizing and in being in a place where it's certainly like there was good food in Massachusetts, but back then, especially when I lived in the suburbs, it was like you go out for dinner, it's like, is it Chinese tonight or Italian? It was just before you were really getting as many types of restaurants. And so I think being in a place where obviously like there are people from all over the world, there's, should we get Vietnamese? Should we get Thai? Should we get Burmese? Should we get Mexican? And like, yeah, the Tex-Mex you were having in suburban Massachusetts is not Mexican food. And I'm like, oh, so I think like that was just like a really like exciting moment. And it's this kind of, at times compelling entry point. This is also now I feel like linking to one of my favorite like food stories, which is about how like a bunch of Thai bureaucrats wanted to like boost the like global recognition of Thailand, both to increase tourism, but maybe also to like help with business development in the country. And so the plan they came up with was to do it through food. So they set a goal of like, let's increase the number of Thai restaurants in countries like the US, Australia, parts of Western Europe, as well as the quality of those restaurants. They like came to agreements with like Australia to create a special visa for like Thai chefs to immigrate there. They made it easier for Thai chefs in those countries to like import Thai ingredients. And part of the reason I think something like Thai takeout and Thai food became so much bigger in the US was like because of their efforts. Like it totally worked. Lots of other countries have since like tried to copy them. You know, Pad Thai became like their greatest ambassador. So I think that was quite exciting to me to move to a place where there was so much excitement about food and there was just like food from all over the world. And it just kind of like gave you a little window to all these places and made you like want to taste more and experience more.
State-backed cuisines. That's amazing.
Yeah, food is so situational. The story, the mood you go into a meal, the way you approach a meal, what's going on in your life really affects it. I know for me, my answer to this would be I grew up in Toronto, so a lot of amazing food, a lot of great Asian food. But like coming to UCLA, there's this one Korean shack on the corner in Westwood that is one of my favorite restaurants in the world. I think like it's my top restaurant on Belly. I'm not a super big Belly user, but it's like my number one restaurant there. But we thank you so much for your time. We know we went so over, so thank you so much. And it was such a great conversation.
Yeah, going over is a sign of a good conversation. So total pleasure. Thanks so much. I so appreciate the interest in the book and in gastronomics.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze the epic, the cool, the interesting learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week we had someone really cool, someone who is in the universe of one of our favorite podcasts, a frequent contributor to Planet Money, and he even wrote the book on it. Kev, what did you think of our conversation with Alex?
Well, it is another one of those episodes where obviously we're talking to someone who understands the craft of what we do very well. One thing that really stood out to me was when he talks about, for Planet Money, introducing the people that they interviewed. It didn't really require you to lay out their full life story, and it's actually more from the more you cut, the more content you cut, the more you edit out, the more you're able to drill down on what is the essence of this story. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. It takes more effort to tell a shorter story, but that effort is ultimately worth it because you get a better version of what's the most important part of the story to tell.
Yeah. I think I always struggle with simplifying, right? I like to over-explain. I like to give different examples. So I think simplifying is something that I think is really important to my journey as a storyteller and something I've been struggling since day one. And, you know, with Alex, there were so many really interesting points that he made about kind of his journey to become a storyteller and why that's important. I think an example he gave to us that really unlocked for me was the Domino's pizza tracker. I remember as a kid, I don't think it was Domino's because I grew up in Toronto, but one of the pizza places, I think Pizza, started a pizza tracker, and it was so cool. I loved it as a kid, ordering it, watching it, saying when it's prepared, when it's coming, tracking it. I don't know if it came any faster, to be honest, and I don't know if I needed to do those details or be so obsessed with my phone seeing where the pizza was. But for some reason, this story they added to a pretty benign part of the user experience made me interested, made me trust it more. Instead of just calling and delivering, there's a storytelling element in there that they just did by auditing the consumer experience and saying, hey, how can we build more touch points? How can we add storytelling to it?
Yeah, it's visibility that it provides.
And it kind of takes you to the next step of something Alex said that was really interesting about how the more he reads like Stephen King books on storytelling, the more he tries to investigate and read and train himself, the more he thinks in metaphor. And if you think in metaphor, if you view the world like that, you can take big concepts and sell the story of it. And that gets investors, that gets buy-in. Not only do you have the skills, but now you can translate it to different audiences and get the buy-in. And to keep everyone updated between recordings, I have been still checking FIFA prices. There's been a couple good prices that I almost bought, but we're waiting, we're searching. We have the 2 pages open. The website's not working. But who knows? Maybe we'll go, maybe we won't. But still hoping.
Yeah, we're doing day trading on Saturdays. That's what this is.
Always got to maximize and get the best price. I'm working on it. But this has been another amazing episode of Linen Suit and Plastic Tie. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube at LSPT Pod. Go to whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Listen to more episodes. Leave a review. Leave 5 stars. It really helps others find the show and share the show. You can also find us at LSPT Pod on Instagram or Linen Suit and Plastic Tie on LinkedIn. So follow us on our channels, leave a review, share it with your friends. We really appreciate it. And thank you for taking some time today to become a better storyteller. We appreciate you. You're doing great. You look amazing. Thanks for joining us.
Linen suit, plastic tie. Linen suit, plastic tie.